Hi, this is Stu Stover again, back again. This time we're going to look at a very odd time period. 1960s was very strange in all sorts of ways, which I'll get into in a second. But also, 1960s sort of started us down a path towards stagflation. Okay, so guys, stagflation is a very odd comment. For the most part, I had dropped it out of my econ classes in the past. And yet here we are, as I do this right now, it's 2025, we're looking at the possibility. And I don't have a wonderful crystal ball here, so I'm not going to tell you what is going to happen, because I don't know. But stagflation is rearing its head in America again. Okay, so what's stagflation? Stagflation is when you have high unemployment and a low growth rate. Okay, so and inflation high too. And we'll talk about all the pieces of stagflation hopefully a little bit later in this segment. But what we talk about today is if we have high unemployment, the standard answer with high unemployment is you drop interest rates. And you stimulate the economy by throwing some money out into society. Interest rates is monetary policy. You can also do it with fiscal policy, as Biden did and Obama did, to try and stimulate the economy with government, federal spending, state spending too for that matter, kicking some money out to try and stimulate not only consumer spending, because if you got more money, it's easier to spend and less risk on defaulting and all the other negative consequences. Can't pay your bills, all that crazy stuff that unfortunately continues to happen. But if unemployment is high, you kick the money out, that incentivizes business to hire more workers, produce more goods, and off we go. All right, so if you've got high inflation, you lower interest rates or you cut back on spending. And what does that do? Okay, as you do all those strategies, you may bring down inflation, but what happens to unemployment? It goes up. And so what you tend to have at the Federal Reserve is this notion of balancing the broad economy against those two issues using interest rates, and the federal government using fiscal policy to deal with some of those kind of things. And so when I talk about stagflation, right now we're watching unemployment start to rise. Okay. We're also starting to see inflation, for a variety of reasons, kick in a little bit more than we would like, and then we're not sure where it's going to go down the road, whether it's going to hit 4, 5, 6, 7%. I mean, who knows at this point. And interest rates right now are fairly high. So a few years ago, I kind of thought interest rates were too high and they should be lowered, but there is always a risk of overheating the economy. That's a wonderful term, but overheating the economy simply means that people are spending too much money, buying too much stuff. Inflation then goes up, because businesses can charge more, and all of the implications of what that means. And so some are arguing that we could very well be approaching stagflation again in American society. That's bad. All sorts of downside issues when we get towards stagflation. It creates huge problems for Federal Reserve, let alone the problems for you and I as individuals in terms of the consequences of that. So let's go through the 60s a bit and talk about what happened and how we got to stagflation in the 1970s. Because it just didn't pop out of the air. All these things, these trends, these programs, all of the stuff happened to build towards that. So let me go back to when John Kennedy was president. And what we had is we had fairly high taxes. Fairly high, pretty high for America in that late 50s, early 60s time period. We actually had a 90% tax bracket for the wealthiest folks. Now, did anybody ever pay 90%? Of course not, because you got all sorts of deductions and ways to minimize your taxes. But still, we had a system that was loaded, that the rich folks were supposed to be paying their fair share. It may be a little different today, who knows, but anyway. So taxes were high. Spending was also pretty high, because we were entering, in the 60s, we were entering Vietnam. We had all sorts of issues that were showing up across America, around the world. And so one of the things that happened is we were in a recession when John Kennedy got elected. Okay, so the strategy of a recession is you can either lower taxes. Lower taxes does what? It puts more money back in people's pocket, gives them the ability to spend more, whatever. Or you can increase spending, and in the vulnerable areas. And because of some of the movements, that becomes more significant to talk about in a minute. But John Kennedy made the decision that Congress was not going to allow him to do more spending. And so he figured the only way he could stimulate the economy was by lowering taxes. Okay, that happened. It took a while, but it got done, and the economy burst into lots of growth. Economic GDP went through the ceiling. It was great stuff. Anyway, so the dilemma here was interesting, because you can stimulate the economy either way. But what was going on? Okay, so you had a emerging anti-war movement, and some of you know this, but we had over 500,000 troops in Vietnam, and I think it was 67 or whatever year was the peak, 550 or something. And so an anti-war movement was emerging that we didn't understand as the American public why we were in Vietnam. Okay, we were in Vietnam theoretically because we wanted to, stop the flow of communism from overwhelming the world. And so the theory of the day was something called the domino theory. So if we let Vietnam fall, then pretty soon Laos is falling, and then Cambodia, and then Thailand, and pretty soon it'll be at our doorstep. And so we had to sort of draw the line. We're going to stop communism there. And kind of in hindsight, all sorts of issues that showed up there. And so what's going on is, even though the economy is booming, inflation is starting to creep up a bit. There's a number of other significant factors, but we also had civil rights. And so Martin Luther King Jr. was leading the charge, and there were lots of other folks, but Martin Luther King to say America is not a place where everybody has the same rights. Same rights to education, same rights to jobs, same rights to where they live, run the list of all of the things. And we were still a pretty racist society. Now, guys, 1960s, I was 10 to 15 in this time period, so it's not that long ago that we talk about that. We also had the women's movement, which was dramatically changing the roles of females. Now, part of it was birth control, but part of it was too is that if you go back to the 1950s, females, and we didn't really like this particularly. We wanted females to be home raising babies and making cookies and the leave it to beaver kind of notions, but females had 3 jobs in general, 3 jobs. One was secretaries, second was teachers, third was nurses. What were the 3 lowest paid professions in America in the 1950s, late 50s? Those 3. So the system economically was loaded against females, the assumption being is that they were making what was called pin money. Okay, so extra money. So extra money to go on a vacation, or extra money to buy, birthday presents, or, whatever it was. But the man was the one who provided the economic stability for the family. And the reality is, even in those days, it was not nearly as simple as all of that. So women's movement was astonishingly powerful. You also had the environmental movement. And so all of a sudden we were starting to become more aware of the environmental consequences. So you had all of these movements that were affecting America, and they were affecting spending in significant ways. And so 1960s, what you do is you lower taxes just as you're about to start to ramp up the war in Vietnam. So you have massive spending, which is in many cases deficit spending in those days, to pay for the war. Lyndon Johnson shows up as president, and he says we got to do a war on communism, but we've also got to do a war on poverty. We have to eliminate for all time poverty. Again, spending piles of money. So I'm not going to throw stones at the history of this stuff right now because, it's history. But what it did is it created a fair amount of stress on our American economic system. And so we started to see the underpinnings for the stagflation that would show up in the 1970s. So let's just fast forward here a little bit. We get into the 1970s, and what we've got is high unemployment, high inflation, and so, we're looking at 6, 8, 9% unemployment. You're looking at 8 to 12% inflation. So if you're an employee in a company and you're running 8 to 12% inflation, what kind of raise do you want? Well, of course, you don't want to lose economic ground. You want a raise that will actually keep you at the same. And guys, frankly, you want to get ahead of the game, so you want a bigger raise than that. So one of the things that starts to happen is there's wage pressure on inflation, which pushes it even higher. Oh. And then you've got all of the government spending in that era, very different than the way we talk about it today, but there was a lot of pressure on just the whole economic system. All right, so what does that mean? Stagflation is awful. So in 1981, I think it was, 80, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates to almost 20%. 20%! How do you buy a house? How do you buy a car? How do you be a normal American? What does that mean for credit card interest rates, all the other stuff? And what was the reason that the Federal Reserve raised the interest rates that high? You've got high unemployment, you've got high inflation. They made the determination, right, wrong, it doesn't matter. They made the determination that we had to solve the inflation problem first. Once you solve the inflation problem, then you can start to stimulate and grow the economy again at a more healthy rate. And having lived through that, that was a very, very painful time in far too many ways. Far too many. And so the issue was the Federal Reserve had to get inflation under control. Once they did, then they could drop the interest rates to more reasonable levels, and we could start to gradually stimulate the economy to get the unemployment rates down, which they did. I mean, we got into the 80s and we had to some degree solve most of those kinds of problems. This is awful. I don't ever want to go back to this, and so my concerns right now is some of the policies that are coming out of Washington right now may be leading us in this direction. We'll see. Again, my crystal ball isn't great, but I did want to point out that there were reasons that we got stagflation. There were typical responses from us as consumers. There were typical responses from the Federal Reserve, the federal government, whatever, to try and deal with this, because this is awful. It's not as bad as hyperinflation. Some other countries may talk about that later, but hyperinflation, creates just in many ways a collapsed economy in some sense. We go back to barter system and other kinds of things. But let me assure you guys, you don't want to go through this. This is awful to go through this. So I know I'm leaving on a rather sour, negative note here, but there's lots of reasons to be hopeful that we have figured out an awful lot of stuff about how to manage the economy. So hopefully we won't go back to this stuff. Thank you very much.